4:03, and I want to welcome everyone to this new global webinar series. It's wonderful to see so many people have joined already, and we've got a fantastic, in my view, and Juvaria's view, and Juvaria and I have been working on this together for quite some time, and we'll be co-chairing and co-hosting and all sorts of other things too as well. So welcome everyone. You may be asking yourselves on a Friday afternoon, why another webinar series when we pretty much had as much Zoom as we could do in a lifetime? And I think the reason is that we've spent so much time building this program, and I think we're trying to do something a little bit different from perhaps other series have done. And that is really to try to open up the dialogue and exchange intellectually on a broader, what we would hope is a global basis, is to strengthen the global, the diverse, the critical, intellectual and scholarly spheres, just by bringing that diversity to bear on the big questions of international system of power. So I guess what we really want to do is to bring together and connect thinkers and ideas on big issues from around the world and try to get a series of voices, uh, speakers, scholars, serious thinkers who may not always be on the same panels in the big international conferences, but we're trying to put in the same room people with different ideas, perspectives, and backgrounds as well. And through that connection, the hope is that we also kind of undergo some sort of change in the way we think and what we know. And maybe through that global conversation, we can kind of connect the different streams of thought and ideas which already exist, but rarely come into conversation with one another. As Antonio Gramsci once famously said, there is no such thing as national history or national language. And I think the problems of the world, the big issues in the world, are thought about, written about, and analyzed and discussed all around the world, yet we often only hear voices from particular selected segments of the world's kind of scholarship and so on. And the idea here is basically very simple, is just to open up the space, create a space to discuss some really big issues, big questions. And as you can see from the website and so on, today we kick off obviously with the liberal international order, something to be interrogated by our speakers, whom Juvaria will introduce in a moment. But next week, we're going to be looking at the United Nations from different perspectives. The following week, Brazilian and Indian perspectives, Brazilian, Indian, and British perspectives on Brexit, Modi, Trump, Bolsonaro. And the following week on big international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD and development. And then race and racism as in understandings of world order. And finally, 6 weeks' time, we'll be looking at the nexus of knowledge and power in world politics. So these are the big kind of questions. This is the first series. Our hope is that there'll be enough interest in order to have a second series after a short break of some big issues. There are plenty of issues, there's no shortage of them, and plenty of very interesting people from around the world who are doing some great research and writing as well. So I intend to learn a great deal by engaging with our speakers, and I hope the same is true for the audience who follow this particular series. So that's the broad aim, is to put in the same room people who may not always share a panel at one of the big conferences and so on. And I want to just ask Juvaria now, the co-chair, to introduce today's speakers and the panel theme, please.
Thank you, Inderjeet. Today's panel theme is the liberal international order, how liberal, international, and orderly. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Cox, who is the director of LSC Ideas. Professor Cox has previously been affiliated with Queen's University in Belfast, and he's lectured at various universities across the UK, and also worked for several government bodies and many private companies. He's also been the chair of the United States discussion group at Chatham House and a senior fellow to the Nobel Institute in Oslo, and also visiting professor at the Center for Defense and Strategic Studies in Canberra. Professor Cox's topic today is the liberal economy deglobalizing? We also have with us Professor Leonardo Ramos, who is an associate professor of international relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas in Brazil. His publications include Gramscian IPE and work on Caesarism, populism, and the 2018 election in Brazil. Thank you for joining us today.
Now, we do have a third speaker as well, but he hasn't actually arrived yet. So, and he was initially billed to speak first. So I guess what we can do is change the order somewhat. So I wonder if Mick, you would mind going?
Yeah, sure,
Thank
Inderjeet. No trouble at all. Be delighted to do so. Firstly, thank you for inviting me, and well done to you and your team at City for putting this on. I know how much work goes into doing all this, how much time it takes to bring speakers together. So again, congratulations. And for bringing together, I think what's going to be a great series. So very well done. I know it's hard work, but it's worth it because we continue that global dialogue, which I think we need more than ever in these particular times in which we are living. Now, let me just say by way of apology, and it's not really by way of apology, I think, I'm not an economist, but even though I'm at the London School of Economics, which by the way is more than just economics, as you know, Inderjeet, it is and political science. So it's much more than just economics, but I'm going to talk on the liberal economy and where I think it might be going and where it's come from, which is another way of asking the question, is globalization under such stress? Are we going to see a form of deglobalization? And wherever you look now on various websites and on, you know, the serious discussions going on, there's clearly questions being asked out there and have been asked for some time, not just recently. And it's not just to do with COVID, about the state of the global economy and where globalization has come from, and whether or not it's going under, or whether or not, in a sense, it's going to be reformed and changed in fundamental ways. I actually look back to find the first iteration, Inderjeet, of the term deglobalization. I first came across it in 2002 with the radical economist Walden Bellow, who in 2002 used the term deglobalization, thinking it would be a very good thing to see deglobalization because it would see, you know, a deconstruction of the neoliberal project which is being expressed through it. But obviously that argument put forward by Walden Bellow many years ago has been taken up much more seriously over the last few years for reasons I will go into. Let me say straight away that I don't think the world economy is about to deglobalize. But I do think, and this is the kind of on the one hand, but on the other hand approach, I do think it is under some very serious stress and has been so for many years. That is my such bumper sticker argument. That I just don't see the conditions under which deglobalize. I don't even know what it would mean to see deglobalization. I'm not even sure it would be a good thing. That's not the same thing of having an uncritical attitude towards globalization. And I suppose my position would be that what I want to see is a reform of the global economy and not just a deglobalization. But the pressures moving in a certain direction are real, and we have to understand where they're coming from. On the other hand, I do think that these pressures go back a long way before COVID. If you read some of the literature out there, they kind of say, well, it starts with COVID and the problems of globalization, which spread the disease. My response to that is yes, but on the other hand, without international global cooperation, we're not going to deal with the pandemic. I only want to repeat the obvious cliche that if you want to solve this pandemic, you've got to do it globally, because if you don't do it globally, you don't do it at all, because this is a global pandemic. But it has raised a series of questions about vaccines, about the relationship between the global north and the global south, and indeed who controls these vaccines. And so that's an important acceleration of a debate going on for a very long time. Let me just go back into globalization itself. I might just for a very brief moment, Inderjeet. There's such a large literature on it, and I've been writing about it recently for the LSE. Now, globalization has been criticized for many years. There's no doubt about it. I mean, almost when the term starts to get used in 1990 or 1991, people start asking a series of very critical questions about it. I remember the first book that I read on it, which for me really captured both the upsides and the very big downsides of globalization, was written by Danny Roderick back in 19 1997 on globalization. And he's done some wonderful, masterly work ever since, looking at the dilemmas or the trilemmas of globalization. But he wasn't the only one. Many critics on the left did not like globalization. You had the Seattle opposition to it, which then took on a widespread form. You had works by people like Naomi Klein, many others, you know, in the late 20th and early part of the 21st century. It's extraordinary actually to see over the last 20 years, if I could be, you know, as broad as that, the 20 years crisis, I suppose you might want to call it, some do, another 20 years crisis, how the debate about globalization has shifted from being globalization is good, globalization works. That was the title, by the way, of a book by Martin Wolf, a rather good writer on world economy, I think, in the Financial Times. I believe that globalization worked, even though there will always be downside losers, and that was always accepted, towards globalization is really something we need to interrogate far more seriously and far much more in depth. And it's interesting to see where the critique of globalization is now coming from. In some ways, everybody now has got something critical to say about globalization. The left obviously continues the critique of globalization. Thomas Piketty's book, which was actually written in French in 2013 and went on to sell in vast numbers, as you know, once it got translated, is a critique of globalization over the very long term, taking it back to the 1980s. His very big focus there, which has become almost mainstream, where you get an open neoliberal capitalist economy, you will get great wealth creation, but you'll get great concentrations of wealth in few hands. And therefore, his extraordinary piece of empirical research to look into how inequalities were the byproduct, the inevitable and necessary, not accidental byproduct of globalization, I think set the tone for the debate on what I call the broad left, on the very broad left. I think Danny Roderick's more recent work too, although whether we call Danny as somebody on the left, but I kind of see him as a critical thinker looking at globalization. He's done recent articles and recent studies, which sort of says that really the problem goes back to the 1990s, when in essence the West, and particularly the United States, under that good liberal Bill Clinton, you know, basically made the case for globalization. I've always thought of Bill Clinton as a liberal president, but also a liberal president who said, quote unquote, globalization is like a law of nature. It's like water running down the hill. It's something which is irresistible. Within the world economy, America has to compete, not retreat. And I think, you know, Clinton, I think, ended up with a very large amount of egg on his face for that almost uncritical adoption of it. And Danny Roderick says, basically, look, when we go back to the 1990s, when we look at the 1990s, that's the period where many of the problems we're looking at now, we kind of accepted, or some accepted, not me, but a number of people accepted, that globalization was both irresistible, inevitable, there was no alternative to it, and would raise all boats together. And there were strong arguments made in favor of it, let's be honest. Poverty reduction in China was put down, not just to Chinese economic policy, but also to it joining the world economy through the World Trade Organization in 2000. The emergence economically of India, again, was seen as a benefit of globalization. Poverty reduction, you know, greater travel, more students moving around the world, the many things which came with, and global GDP undoubtedly did rise. And of course, you know, an economist would always say, well, look back, not just to what happened since 1990, but look back to the great economists like David Ricardo in the early part of the 19th century, talking the case for comparative advantage. It's kind of built into the DNA, I think, of how most economists think about globalization, even some of the more critical ones. But certainly the left, in a sense, ran with it again, and I think, you know, did actually set more of an agenda than they'd done even in the 1990s, certainly through the work of people like Thomas Piketty. It also became interesting in mainstream as well, Inderjeet. It's quite interesting to see how Piketty's work and the critique of globalization suddenly became much more mainstream. Nobody could any longer, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, say that globalization does good for everybody in the world. You know, raises poverty, it's allowed China to re-enter the world economy, Indian poverty reduction, Chinese poverty reduction, allows us to travel, to go on holiday to places we could never have afforded before, etc. Nobody was any longer making what I would call that rather uncritical. It went very mainstream into the IMF, into the World Bank. You can see it in their report. It almost got into the body of what I would call, the international global elite. They could no longer resist some of the arguments that were being made. But moreover, and this, in a sense, the third group of people who picked up on it, of course, and this, in a sense, becomes far more problematic from a political point of view, Inderjeet, was, of course, the populist right. And nobody was more on the populist right and more effective at pushing the line or pushing the argument against globalization, or what he called globalism, than Donald Trump. I know that you've written a lot, broadcast a lot on the United States, but you know and I know that what Donald Trump did very effectively and quite brilliantly, although I'm not sure either you or I would be his greatest fans or supporters, but nonetheless, certainly picked up on the fact that with 2008 and that the American liberal elite had, in a sense, sold many Americans down the line, that they had benefited and ordinary Americans hadn't. The manufacturers, good manufacturing, high-paying jobs had gone. Stagnant wages. It's quite remarkable now to look back through some of Trump's speeches. Much of it is appalling on immigration, on race, on Muslims and Islam. Don't get me wrong. But nonetheless, when you get to the political economy, some of the things he said really did strike home, and clearly in part, that is why he won, and why indeed the last 4 years have been so dominant. So we've moved from a very different kind of period of the 1990s, the Clinton moment, if I can call it that, where globalization seems to be both inevitable, irresistible and good, towards where we are today with a widespread view that globalization itself is in question. Something has to be either done about it, reformed, or indeed ultimately rejected. Why has that happened? A number of reasons. As Danny Roderick pointed out many years ago, there are inherent downside problems inside globalization from the very beginning. If you open your economy up to full-scale competition, particularly from lower wage economies, you're going to lose a lot of manufacturing jobs. That's not the only reason why manufacturing jobs go. The idea that it's all about China is complete nonsense. Technology does a lot of this as well, not just globalization. But it was inherent within globalization, or at least a particular form of deregulated globalization, which was part of the kind of wider neoliberal agenda, which even goes back to the 1970s. Secondly, of course, before very, very briefly, you have to look at what happened in 2008. Now, again, if you look at what caused 2008, well, I'll give you 10 reasons, 10 different explanations, 10 different theories of what happened in 2008. I won't try and rehearse all of them. It's much too complicated. I think ultimately 2008 happened because in large part, people thought it couldn't happen. The efficient market hypothesis, which was very dominant amongst economies, essentially said, you can't have a big dip. You can't have a big collapse. You can't have what happened in 2008. Well, that was the theory. The practice was that by the end of 2008, the world economy was staring over the edge into another 1930s. And to get out of that, and the way that the West, and particularly the United States and the G7 countries, Japan and others, made their way out of that, were actually quite costly, particularly costly in Europe, where austerity became the norm. Austerity, of course, was practiced in the UK over a 10-year period with consequences which I think ultimately led to Brexit in 2016. But it also had terrible downside consequences in the United States, which led to Trump. Trump was a function of many, many other factors in that crisis, but it clearly has to be seen as a material response to what happened in 2008. And then we do get 2016. If you take Brexit and Trump together, that again raises very large questions about integration into a wider global economy, whether it's integration of UK into the largest trading bloc in the world, which is called the European Union, or whether it's America's relationship to the rest of the world economy. And then lastly, but by no means least, we get COVID itself, which both illustrates, it seems to me, some of the upside consequences of globalization. All of the scientists, by the way, cooperate. The notion that somehow now all these scientists are cooperating across the board. Even most of these very large pharmaceutical companies which are producing the vaccine are not just international, but the people who work within them are international. So the idea there's some national response to this is just a nonsense. But COVID has clearly raised yet again that particular question. I'd also add 2 or 3 other brief points why I think the debate about globalization has shifted into a far more negative arena, and why the argument about deglobalization is back on the agenda. And then I'll conclude in the next 4 or 5 minutes, if I could, Inderjeet. I think part of it really clearly has to do about the China-US relationship. There's no doubt, I mean, but these are the 2 dominant economies in the world. They represent about 40, 50%, 45% of global GDP. The United States has identified China as the key rising power of the 21st century, the key threat of the 21st century. And inevitably, in that increasingly conflictual environment, both sides, which have hitherto been very dependent economically on one another, are asking questions about their economic relationship. Not surprisingly, China now believes and thinks, or some of its leaders clearly think, that if you're too dependent on the outside world, you're too dependent on the West, and you're too dependent potentially on the United States, which is your rival. So you're caught in a dilemma, a real dilemma, that the market upon which you've become very dependent is also the market of a Western economies, both the EU and the United States, which actually is now turning against China. Not surprising, for reasons we can go into, but not surprisingly, China is therefore beginning to think much more seriously about self-reliance. How much can you do at home rather than being entirely dependent on foreign markets? How far that can go, I don't know. I think not as far as some of them would want to go, but it is certainly part of the story. The other part of the story is the United States. Even the Democrats, I would say even the Democrats, even Joe Biden, cannot stand up today and make a strong case for free trade. You know, he cannot stand up, as indeed, you know, Bill Clinton stood up over 20, 25 years ago and say, globalization is good for you. It's good for you, good for America, good for the world. That kind of almost theological argument for global. And Joe Biden could never stand up today and make that case. And not only because, you know, Donald Trump got 73 million votes. Those people presumably were not voting for Trump and therefore for globalization, one must assume. It is also that his own democratic basis itself would want to ask big questions about the meaning. Remember, you know, Senator Sanders, who was still an influence, by the way, in the Democratic Party, he's got more influence, I think, than people know. Nonetheless, Biden got elected with a lot of left-wing support. Now, whether the left has been marginalized in the Democratic Party or not, we can talk about, but nonetheless, he knows he got in the end because the enormous mobilization of the left was inside the Democratic Party. That's my reading of it anyway, from afar. And he can't therefore turn around and say, now what we're going to do is go back to free trade. And therefore, that's another dimension in this. Again, this doesn't mean America leaves the world economy. It doesn't deglobalize, but it does put increasing pressure looking towards America itself. And some of the more interesting speeches, if I might say so, that Biden has made have not just been on formal foreign policy, though some of them I actually do think are quite interesting, and certainly a lot more acceptable than some of the things that Donald Trump used to say. We'll see how it goes. But some of the more interesting speeches I think he's made has been on the economy, often not reported so much. And the argument about made in America, don't forget that. Made in America, those have been some of the strong. I want to create 5-6 million new working class jobs, trade union jobs. You know, that's what he's been saying. Now, that is not an argument, therefore, for free trade. That is an argument for being made in America, for America, making stuff in America for Americans to create high-paying trade union jobs. Interesting, he actually uses terms like trade unions and even the words like working. So there's another dimension why I think people are talking about the current crisis in globalization, what's going on inside the United States. So, and last but by no means least, and I'll end here, Inderjeet, with 1 or 2 final comments if I could. It's also what's going on inside the European Union itself, leaving aside Brexit for the moment, our own little local difficulty. That little local difficulty, by the way, is getting very, very critical. There was an excellent article recently by a British journalist in The Guardian called Mick Cox, which I'd really recommend to people to read, saying how actually the press and the BBC and many others are actually not talking fully and completely about the real crisis the British economy is going to face as a result of Brexit. Nobody wants to talk about it at the moment, even indeed the Labour Party, in a sense, the coronavirus crisis, in a sense, has obscured that deeper problem that the British are now in by virtue of leaving the European Union. However, that said, the truth of the matter is the real story is the European Union. Now, the European Union is an open economy. It preaches multilateralism. I'm very much in favor of it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a Brexiteer by any means. Nonetheless, there are moves within inside the European Union towards what they call strategic autonomy. And that strategic autonomy is not just about defense and foreign policy. It is also about developing an industrial policy for Europe, of developing a European policy on, say, intelligence, intelligence in the economic sense, of developing European industries. Now, again, this doesn't mean that the European Union leaves the world economy. It can't. It's too much integrated into, in the same way that China and the United States are too much integrated into. But there are tendencies pushing in a certain direction. So to conclude, and just to get back what I said at the very beginning, Inderjeet, if I might, the pressures moving in a certain direction are clear. The uncritical acceptance of a certain kind of globalization that is now almost off the political agenda. Nobody, I think, seriously can any longer kind of make the kinds of arguments which we heard people like Tony Blair make in this country, or Bill Clinton used to make in the United States in the 1990s. And as we've seen, we've been through several crises on the level of the economy, whether it was 2008, whether it was the result of Trump's economic policies, whether it was the result of Brexit, and whether it's the result of this terrible pandemic called COVID, all of which are driving it in a certain direction. The question of globalization will now become one of the #1 questions moving forward. I know there are many, many other issues, all of them related actually, on climate change, on inequality, on race. All of these questions will be folded into, it seems to me, a much larger debate. And what I hope, and what I certainly, as somebody with my politics, certainly would advocate, is that the left has to become involved in this debate and actually push an argument strongly, not necessarily to, in a sense, denounce globalization. We can critique it forever and ever and ever. I'm totally able to critique as much of globalization as you like, but also how we can put forward an agenda which sees major reforms in that, which leads to a more equal, a less unequal, a world in which, you know, people can gain hope, and in which they believe they, young people, older people, working class people, middle class people, north and south in every country, believe they can have a future. Who will make those cases in the political arena? We yet have to wait to see who's going to come along. So that's all I want to say for the moment. Inderjeet, thank you for hosting this, I hope, excellent debate and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Cox. We have Professor Randolph Persaud with us now, and I'll just briefly introduce him. He is from the American University of Washington, where he is Associate Professor of International Relations, and he specializes in the areas of race and international relations, globalization, human security, as well as the politics of identity. He is the Director of Comparative and Regional Studies and has authored several publications, including Counter-Hegemony and Foreign Policy. Most recently, we're very pleased to have him with us today, and he is going to speak on the liberal international order as academic innovation and ideological practice. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really do have to apologize in this age of Zoom. I actually thought the meeting was at 3 o'clock Washington, D.C. time. And so I really apologize. I know so many notices came, and it was one of those things. My mind was simply set at 3 p.m. this afternoon, and I apologize. My presentation is not fully completed, but the core ideas are there in my mind, and I know what I want to argue. So I have a couple of slides which I'll put up right now if I can. Let's get that there. And now how are we going to do this? So if I put them up, you can share them, Juvaria?
I think you have sharing rights, but if you can just check and let me know.
Oh, yes, 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 I do see that. So let me go there. Okay, hang on for a second. Share. Share. And there. Okay. Are you able to see this? Yeah.
Yeah.
So very good. So let me the core arguments are actually here, and I will simply elaborate on them a bit more and then develop them and send it out to Inderjeet later on. So I start out with this well-known claim by Alexander Wendt that anarchy is what states make of it. The argument, of course, is recognizably constructivist in method. I follow along a similar path, although I am not really working within the constructivist method. So along these lines, but drawing more on critical theory in post-colonialism, I'm suggesting that the whole idea of the liberal international order is to a significant extent what scholars make of it. There is an actually existing set of realities and practices and institutional forms to the extent that there's a coherent entity called the liberal international economic order is rather debatable. And I think it could be demonstrated empirically over a very long period of time, and that depends on how far back you want to go and um, claim that the liberal international orders existed. John Eikenberry, for instance, has made the argument in Liberal Leviathan that the West has been laboring away for 200 years in bringing about a liberal international order. And so that begs the question as to exactly what constitutes liberalism. My second point is that I argue that the scholarship that adumbrates advances and defends claims about the liberal international order, though independent, is not structurally divorced from the grand strategy of states that derive the most benefits from the LIO as the anchoring institutional form of world order. So stated differently, scholars, working in universities and think tanks, and of course, I'm in Washington, D.C., where there's no shortage of think tanks and production of knowledges that orient us towards globalization, towards acceptance of the key elements of a liberal international order, that there's sufficient remove, but one really has to begin to ask questions about, the extent of the distance. It leads me to the third point, which is I further suggest that theories of liberal international order are simultaneously ideological practices that go beyond explanation per se, insofar as they are intended to bring legitimacy to the material aspects of hegemonic practices of the dominant states. So I was looking recently at Stephen Walt in a really good essay in which he talks about the relationship between theory and policy and practice, and he lays out in there several requirements. The only two theories that come close to being scientific, according to his measure, one of them is democratic peace theory. And so if I were to take that seriously, I think there is very strong evidence to suggest that whilst democracies don't go to war with each other, a key claim in the LIO, they have been very busy actually for a very long period of time disrupting democratically elected government. And this can be easily demonstrated. There's a whole long list of democratically elected governments that were deposed and actually replaced by authoritarian leaders. So if indeed part of what the liberal international order is intended to do is to put in place a democratic ethos and then to work towards embedding liberal democracies worldwide, I have to say that the evidence is rather selective on this. We tend to coddle authoritarian regimes, including still essentially settler colonial states. And if we do not depose, if the major players of the LIO do not depose and have not deposed, removed democratically elected governments, they have disciplined them in all sorts of different ways, exactly through the institutions of the liberal international order, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and the WTO as well, using the instruments of TRIPS, for instance, to monopolize intellectual property rights in ways that go against some of the very basic principles of what a liberal international order should produce, which is cooperation, a greater sense of, of responsible human conduct. We see this most recently, in fact, currently, and still to come, in a bizarre kind of, vaccine nationalism, with all kinds of threats against states such as Brazil and India and South Africa, the usual suspects that want to actually, in my view, actually practice what to be core elements of a liberal international order. I'll move to the second slide. There is sufficient evidence, in my view, to reasonably claim that theorizing intensifies during periods of challenge to Western and especially American hegemony. This can be easily demonstrated. Kindleberger's first work really came at the time when the United States started to face the first challenges to, to its balance of payment issues and trade deficits. You look at something like, say, 1977, the book by Cohen and I on interdependence theory. It was, in a way, in and of itself, it's interesting work. It's got a strong empirical basis to it, but it was also there to challenge dependency theory. Dependency theory, although there are evident weaknesses to it, the thing is, it served a larger purpose of orienting a kind of counter-hegemonic movement on a world scale. And a good deal of interdependence theory was actually aimed at ruining the prestige of dependency theory. You look at regime theory, 1984, Robert Cohen's book, and the work of Krasner. It came about in, basically with anxieties about American decline. And so therefore, regimes had to be, how shall we put it, theoretically innovated to reconstruct the basis for American leadership without hegemony. And so in this particular instance then, what you find is that what comes across as theory is really a dimension of the grand strategy of the United States. Put differently then, theorizing the liberal international order is a dimension of the grand strategy of the great powers. Yeah. Bound to Lead. I don't know how many of you remember Bound to Lead with Professor Joseph Nye, who I might add was also, Assistant Secretary of Defense. And there he goes. There's a kind of a intricate relationship between knowledge production, working in government, and the proposals that come out of theoretical practice. The idea of soft power emerged, and this is a really important point for me. One of the arguments that I'm working on and I want to develop and I want to state it here is that theory such as soft power is really something, in its crudest way, in its crudest form, is really producing intelligent ways of talking about the world when you are faced with a lot of contradictions. I almost see it at times, and I base this upon, 30 years in the classroom, the way in which a student would almost by default say, how about soft power? As if soft power has an inherently, and automatically sort of compelling basis for you to make claims and proposition, as if it were an actually existing reality, when in fact soft power is a very complicated, what is called soft power, what is extrapolated as soft power, is a complex set of practices of intervention, of discipline, of marginalization, and so on and so forth. And then more recently, I mean, you think of it in 1999, when you know, Daniel Dewdney, for instance, The Nature and Sources of Liberal International Order. It's all again about the decline of the liberal international order and the challenges that are coming to it. Eikenberry's more recent article decrying the way in which multilateralism is against the rocks because of Donald Trump. And there are a lot of questions raised about the quality, you know, of multilateralism under Donald Trump, whether it's a passing phase and so on and so forth. And I would say a big scramble to produce, to get theoretically innovative again, to reorient the world to accommodating the Trumpian strategy of America first, to make it still something that is defendable and defensible. But ultimately, and I say that there's a recent book that came out by Embry, which basically says that we might be experiencing a little bit of a diversion here, but the core aspects of Western leadership and American leadership are there and secure, and they have been there for a long time. Fifth, accordingly, I suggest that the theoretical innovation is part of what I would call now an academic industrial military complex, whereby step-level innovation is organized around state-related sets of practices to not only explain the world, but to produce requisite knowledges to ruin the prestige of competing knowledges and to restabilize domination under the rubric of leadership. Now, here is where I want to go with this. Two ways. One is a recent book published by Isaac Kamola, Making the World Global. I really highly recommend this book. And Kamola is able to show in a very determined, clear, and systematic way that the idea of globalization, the idea of it, and the wide acceptance as globalization as an actually existent set of practices is very much, you know, the outcome, or at least partly a big part of our understanding of it is because of what academics have produced and retailed and through think tanks. And then you produce the sort of like the high-end knowledge at the level of theory, and then it goes on to the grad students and to journalists, and then to the think tanks, and then you have all of the talking heads on TV talking globalization up as if it's going to be the next thing that delivered from where I am here, the American public, back to global leadership. I might remind you, I raised this point the other day with Embry when he made the point. Embry was a speechwriter for Secretary of State Kerry, and it's just come out with a book about the liberal international order. So one of the things, so I recommend reading this book by Kamola, which shows in clear fashion that what we think of globalization, how positive it is, how much unity it brings about in the world, and so on and so forth, and creating a larger economic pie where we'll all benefit, although not equally, is really very much part of the work of academics and work of scholars. Now, here is a surprising thing. What actually led me to this exploration is I went back and I started to read the very first books that came out in international relations. There's a book here in 1916 that came out called An Introduction to the Study of International Relations by Grant, Hughes, and Greenwood. I don't know how many of you have encountered it. And I went back and I looked at lectures given at King's College London. And I went back and looked at the opening of Chatham House in London. And there's something remarkably striking about what happened 100 years ago and what I'm hearing today. And what I heard 100 years ago is that the rest of the world should be ably led by by Britain in constructing what we very well would call a liberal international economic order. This book, An Introduction to the Study of International Relations, has a very long chapter on a liberal international economic order, albeit framed with a bunch of caveats, what Parker Chatterjee has called colonial exceptions, which basically means general propositions and claims of a universal kind are made, and then there are a whole bunch of exceptions when it applies to others, namely the colonies and the dependencies and what have you, not so much the dominions. Hey, the argument is that free trade, right, notwithstanding sort of whatever reservations one might have about the Manchester School in this 1916 book, is that free trade will bring a great deal of good to the backward races. It will introduce material development. It will orient them towards better governance. It will weed out corruption. And it would set in place a rules-based system that will discipline recalcitrant traders who went into the colonies but were not following all of the rules. And so what is the proposal then? That you could have, the big question was, could you have a democracy ruling an empire? That was a huge question. Here's the point. It was, the question was this, it was posed as if it were a problem of international theory. And international theory, that's what we call international theory, basically became a theory of the management of empire. I am making the argument now that by no means can one say that, in 2020 is what obtained, it's not similar, but there are resonances there. A lot of the arguments about fighting corruption in the global south, about taking, good forms of governance to them, of strengthening capacity. A lot of these things are remarkably similar, perhaps in intent, and a good deal of it also in practices. Let me make a couple of final points on the empirical side. It is impossible, in my view, to claim anything about the liberal international economic order when all of the key international institutions from 1815 onwards violated every single aspect of equality of all human beings and of all states. It's never happened. The League of Nations was a sellout. It preserved colonialism and yet claimed that it was liberal. World War II ended, and immediately upon ending it, the greatest leader of the protecting the liberalism, Winston Churchill, immediately embarked upon denying the people who had fought with the British Empire to defend Britain, essentially, to deny them their rights. Where is the liberalism? If by liberalism the most basic assumption is that there is basic equality, you cannot deny that. I come from British Guyana, and I can tell you that one of the acts of Prime Minister Churchill was to overthrow a democratically elected government, the first actually socialist democratically elected government in the Western Hemisphere. He did so in 1953, suspended the constitution, and basically said that the government had not learned enough. Chedi Jagan had not learned enough how to rule, and so a whole thing was set about in process to depose the government, which did happen. The last final point is that theorists of the liberal international order must come to grips at some time with the with the embedded kind of civilizational assumptions that are deeply embedded in it. Empire is built in race. There's no doubt about that. And we have to ask the question, when we hear about, globalization, I think, for instance, of Barnett's work and a blueprint, and when he says that challenges to the liberal international order will come from those places that globalization has not touched. So what should be the task of liberal states is to take globalization to them, whether they like it or not. Why? Because they perhaps do not see the benefits of what liberal democracy and capitalist open markets and joining the international trade system, what benefits it bring to them, that they have to be educated in it. And I do have to say that I hear resonances that are very uncomfortable that go back to about 100 years ago. So I did not finish writing up this presentation because I really thought it was going to be at 3 o'clock my time this afternoon. But those are really about the core ideas. I can take any aspect of those, especially things like regime theory and soft power, and demonstrate that they are inextricably linked to anxieties about American decline. Let me leave it there for now, please.
Thank you so much, Professor Persaud. We have one more talk by Professor Leonardo Ramos now. He'll be discussing the organic crises of the Western liberal order, the Biden administration, and US hegemony. And after that, we will have some time for Q&A. And I encourage everyone with a question or a comment to please post it in the chat and we can collate them immediately after the talk and have a nice discussion, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Juvaria. Thank you, Inderjeet, for the invitation. Randolph, Mick, for your presentations are very nice. And thanks a lot for this opportunity to be here and to partake some of my thoughts, some of my impressions concerning the contemporary situation of the world order. Well, my intention here is, as the title that I sent you says, to discuss some elements concerning not only an interpretation of the interregnum following Gramsci's ideas, not only the interregnum that emerged in the current organic crisis in a broader sense, but also how, in such contexts of COVID pandemic, US hegemony, and this international liberal order or Western liberal order relates to each other. Hence, I'm trying to following Gramsci in order to develop a kind of analysis of situation, and in this sense, looking to the relationship between structure and superstructure, organic and conjunctural movements in this particular period of the world order. In this sense, the idea is to focus on the current crisis of the international liberal order, the US role on such process, and some conditions of possibility for the current US administration of Biden. Since the financial crisis, a series of turbulences have struck the pillars of the international liberal order. The rise of the alt-right governments, mainly Donald Trump in the United States, are challenging post-World War II international norms, economic and trade liberalization, and the limits of the international cooperation on the international financial system. In the same vein, the reverberations of the Crimea crisis in 2014 showed that the international security cooperation has potentially reached its limits. Further, the United States' unchangeable position regarding the reforms of the IMF, the World Bank, and the immobility of the Security Council on some questions reveals the real openness of the architects to really reform the international liberal order. Last, the rise of the alt-right and their autocratic affinity coupled with the increasing importance of non-Western countries that are not models of liberal democracy, like China or Russia, draw attention to the limits of liberal democracy as a desirable narrative in the global governance nowadays. At its core, the international order mirrors the limitations faced by the United States to reproduce its hegemony globally, in particular through international institutions. As the chief architect of the liberal order, the United States has not been able to eliminate its points of tension. Instead, in the last years, with Trump government, United States have, in some sense, departed from its own liberal order, criticizing the multilateral institutions, abandoning historical alliances, questioning trade agreements, and not fully supporting liberal democracy, be internally or externally. The withdrawal of central states from the international liberal order has led the system to a crisis of authority. There's a void that cannot be captured by the old ordering framework and by the old actors that represent the dying order. On the economic side, the principal crisis drivers are the structural changes and long-term developments of the global economy and how the American hegemony projects on it. On the political side, two components are in play. First, the crisis manifests at the state level on the dynamics between national developments and the international sphere. Second, the underlying domestic societal changes that undermine ideational support for the international liberal order. In Gramscian terms, such situation alludes to the idea of organic crisis or a rupture between structure and superstructure determined by the emergence of contradictions which manifests when the superstructure does not develop itself in conformity with the structure. They challenge the very fundamentals on which social orders are built upon. They produce the morbid symptoms, the famous morbid symptoms that disrupt everyday political and economic life, and in the long run, destroy old societal orders and power relations. In an organic crisis, the economic moment is a crucial one. In fact, it's the basis of the rupture between structure and superstructure. However, it could be a mistake to associate the crisis only to its structural and economic moment. Conjunctural movements are also relevant, and particularly I would like to emphasize this point because it's a crucial one on my argument concerning Biden administration. The political response to the crisis challenges, sets important parameters to understand its unfolding and the possibilities to solve or accommodate some of its contradictions. It seems very clear, this discussion on Gramsci, when he discussed the passive revolution process, passive revolution possibilities, the limited hegemony influence, and so on and so on. So, in this sense, an analysis of situation demands a comprehension on how social forces are coping with the political possibilities during the crisis. And if we look to the world order in current times, the analogy of the perfect storm seems appropriate. As in a perfect storm, when two atmospheric phenomena of great proportion, such as hurricane and a storm, combine in a way that it amplifies their effects. The current organic crisis combines with the coronavirus pandemic, initially an occasional and fleeting even, but whose development suggests a great historical reach. Also, namely, critical domestic and international conjunctures come together so as to combine in a very particular way in the United States, urging crucial political actions from Biden administration in order to rebuild, at least in a limited scope, US hegemony through a particular world order. If hegemony can be seen as the synthesis of domination and leadership, so 4 years of Donald Trump have damaged US credibility and leadership globally. Following the title of our event, it combines in order to make the liberal international order less liberal, less international, and less orderly in this sense. And so, if Trump's America First policy and abandonment of multilateral institutions weakened the international liberal order, as well as emboldened the more powerful challengers to that order, such as China and Russia. And in this vein, we can highlight at least 3 main aspects of the world order that Biden administration should pay particular attention. In a context of organic crisis, each one of this topic or this aspect, that's also a tension, expresses important contradictions. May I say, each one of them express internal contradictions as well, contradictions among themselves. So, as we are talking about the possibilities or the necessity to pay attention to the political aspect in a crisis, in an organic crisis situation, so the political response of the United States government give to each one of these topics will be paramount to the future of the world order, in my opinion. Of course, there are other topics, but I would like to detach just 3. So in order to develop the argument and so we can talk about this more. First aspect are the national international tensions, particularly related to the economic priorities. Biden said that rebuilding at home is priority number 1 of his administration. At the same time, he also said he's going to waste no time reinvigorating US alliance and re-engaging in multilateral institutions and endeavors. However, some elements of the Build Back Better plan could be in conflict with Biden's international priorities. For example, will the pledge to Buy American work against the effort to rebuild ties with US allies? What's the relationship of this first contradiction, internal, national, that I'd like to highlight? Second aspect regards to the Asian, what I would name multilateralism strikes back as a question. Or in other words, the tensions, Asian and European tensions. First, between the new administration's aversion or little aversion to traditional trade negotiations, for example, its lack of interest to rejoin the TPP agreement. And at the same time, its desire to reestablish the US leadership in the Indo-Pacific region. Second, while Europeans cheer Biden's victory, they must be prepared to see a renewed American demand concerning the defense spending, for example, the European defense spending concerning NATO and things like that. By the same token, Germany should expect more US pushback against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, for example, also. In fact, even as Biden presents himself as the anti-Trump, probably he'll continue to pursue some of the same core US strategic interests when it comes to China, Russia, and commercial competition with Europe, for example. And third aspect concerns the tensions of US and China. Biden administration probably will maintain policies that promote a selective decoupling of the two economies. At the same time, Biden administration will also feel compelled to engage with China to address some global challenges where China is part of the problem or the solution or both, including, for example, pandemics, climate change, nuclear proliferation, and so on. Besides that, an important point that calls attention to the contradictions among the three aspects that I'm talking about is regard to some characteristics concerning China's economy, which is highly internationally integrated. Well, although this is a source of vulnerability for China, in some sense, it's also a source of influence. And in a sense, the Chinese market exerts a magnetic pull on a host of countries across the globe in so strong sense that most countries would like to have good relations with both US and China. Or what I'm saying is that they will not willingly choose the US over China. And so this can be a source of tension also between US and China, and with consequence to think about the future of the international liberal order. In sum, the current contradictions between structure and superstructure present serious limits to US leadership. If the financial crisis of 2007-2008 can be seen as the apex of organic process that at the time hit the epicenter of capitalism, Trump administration and the current COVID pandemic combined in a perfect storm, bringing together organic and conjunctural aspects that erodes even more the international liberal order and therefore the US hegemony. If Biden administration be successful in dealing with such contradictions through ideological engagement, international norms and institutions, as well as through the force, maybe it could contribute to rebuild a world order, not so Western nor liberal at all, but more pluralistic, with China being a crucial actor in it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, all three of you. Those are really interesting, very thought-provoking, with interesting in the sense that there are overlaps. None of you accepts the kind of that we are not in crisis, that there is a crisis. And I guess we got some questions in the Q&A, but I wonder if I could just start with a question for all three of you, that you believe that there is this kind of deep crisis of the entire order. But do you see, now, of course, there's the Gramscian view would suggest that some sort of revolutionary break with the past would be required, but we have seen, if you like, the resilience of liberal leadership, statespeople, and so on over time. And we've seen the construction and reconstruction of liberal internationalism over time. Do you think now we're in some sort of situation where there is no in-system kind of reform possible, which could give it a lease of life for like a generation? So you had a kind of crisis of the 60s and 70s, which gets resolved in one way or another, but comes out later and maybe in greater levels of challenges and multipolarity? Is there no multipolar kind of accommodation which could recognize the problems of globalization in an unlimited way, but at the same, and thereby at the same time kind of align the major economic and other powers, and also thereby protect domestic populations against the worst kind of effects of globalization itself?
Mm.
You know, is there no in-system kind of a reform possible, or is it going to be a kind of breakdown, disorder, and kind of chaos?
Shall I
Yeah, go ahead.
first, Inderjeet, and then leave it to Randolph and Leonardo if they want to follow up or obviously make their own points. Any system is always reformable. I've been around the left for far too long, really, and I can go back to a very long time. And in my old days, in the 60s, even, dear, don't I sound old? Where you used to go down in the morning, pick up the left-wing paper, and I remember one headline saying, "Capitalism in crisis, it's all over." And we did go through a crisis in the 60s and the 70s, and the economy reformed itself in a very neoliberal market direction. It moved from Keynesianism to Hayekian free. And then we were talking in the 1980s and 70s about America being in decline. Paul Kennedy wrote that famous book in '87, you remember? Fall of Great Powers. It wasn't just about America, but guess what? By the 1990s, we're talking about a unipolar order. We go back even further to the 1930s, not back to the pre-First World War period as Randolph did, but that's very useful observations by Randolph, I thought, very interesting. We go back to the 1930s, who would have said that American capitalism could survive? Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt came along and implemented a series of not the most radical reforms in the world, but it saved the system. So in a way, I think we've got to be really aware of the historical situation, and be aware of history, as I think we always should be. But, no system collapses. As a man called Ulyanov, who's better known as Lenin to most people, once said, no system collapses, it has to be overthrown, and there has to be an alternative to it. Now, at the moment, I suppose in a long-term historical sense, I've been arguing this for years, the problem is, if we want to call it a problem, it is actually part of the crisis, that the alternative that many people, not myself, thought we had until 1989, that alternative, which was Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, etc., the socialist camp, as it was once referred to, that alternative collapsed and died and was consigned into the dustbin of history. We can talk about the reasons for that. And I think that is still an important part of the situation we are in today. We can talk forever and ever and ever about levels of inequality, etc., 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 all the problems facing, and it is a crisis. But I think one can get through crisis if there is no alternative. And B, actually, I think, capitalism has proven itself to be remarkably resilient at finding answers to problems that are posed for it. Sometimes some pretty blunt and brutal solutions as well. So it's reformable. Is it a permanent crisis, goes on forever? Probably not. But until there is some kind of alternative to what we've got, then it will go on and on. And, we may move, as I think Leonardo was hinting, in the Gramscian sense, we're kind of an interregnum between one system, which is, in a sense, past its sell-by date, if I can put it like that, and a new order, which we can only basically grasp theoretically. And we're in that kind of interregnum moment where all sorts of strange things happen. And I suppose in some senses, Brexit and Trump are both reflections of that interregnum kind of peculiar pathology where we find itself. And on Trump, because in a sense, it's an extraordinary phenomenon, going back to Leonardo's observation. It is quite extraordinary. I think, Leonardo, you brought it out so well. We know why Trump got elected. We won't go into all the detail. But he got elected in the peculiar American electoral system. He came in. I mean, and immediately said about deconstructing an order which had worked to the United States' overall historical advantage since the end of the Second World War. Quite remarkable attempt to kind of undermine the very order upon which American hegemony, which you've written about, Inderjeet and myself, since the end of the Second World War. And the question is, why did that happen? Without going into all the ridiculous conspiracy theory, in a way, it gets back to what I was saying in my own quick observations at the very beginning. You know, clearly the downsides of globalization, not only, but clearly the major downsides of globalization meant that there were enough people within the United States, in particular within the United States, who saw no interest of their own in a system which was called global. And let's be perfectly honest, those large numbers of people have not gone away. You know, Trump lost, clearly, but over 70 million people voted for him. So Trump may have gone temporarily, at least off the immediate stage, but something called Trumpism is still there. And I think that is still part of the crisis. Final point I'd make on this, and it's only a very rough and ready answer to your very good question. I think this is also what's worrying quite a lot of people. You know, can Joe Biden, you know, who's clearly a reformist, I call him a kind of, I don't know quite how to characterize him, a middle of the road, kind of very right-wing social democrat. I don't quite know how you'd put him in terms that I and you would understand, but something along those lines. I think, you know, the problem with it's going to be for Biden is that he may kind of talk a good talk, as many people would say, on the Iran nuclear deal, on restoring alliances, coming back into the Paris climate agreement, rejoining the WHO, World Health Organization. I'm sure we're all in favor of that. Talking sense on science, talking cooperation with other states. All of that we must presumably support and endorse, given what we've been through. But it seems to me, and this is in a way a measure of the crisis, is it not, Inderjeet? It's going to be extraordinarily difficult for him to achieve what he wants to achieve. You know, it's not just how deep is the COVID crisis in the United States, and it is extraordinarily deep. It's not just that the economy, you know, is suffering enormously, though the rich aren't, by the way. They've done very well out of this. The big corporations have actually done pretty well out of the crisis. It is the depth of the economic crisis, both within the United States and globally, is so big that how are you going to deal with it? You know, 25% of world trade has disappeared through 2020. You know, this is just unbelievable. This is like the 1930s all over again. The only way forward, as I see it, in terms of getting back to your final point about reform, I think they're going to have to return to something they rejected in the 1970s. And that's Keynesianism. I can't see that they can forever continue with this kind of free market nostrum that markets will, in a sense, solve the problems. And I think that's the way I see it moving forward. I may be wrong. It may not even be a long-term solution, but I think that's where we're going to move back towards, which would be part of that broader reform agenda. And the answer to your question is yes, they can reform if they're prepared, in a sense, to, I suppose, ditch the last 30 or 40 years of economic orthodoxy and go back to Keynes, who was not exactly the most radical of people, but at least did understand that when the system is in crisis, do something about it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mick. That's a really good comprehensive answer as well. Randy, you got a question in the Q&A from Steve Rolfe, who says, do you see that the obfuscations of international theory are a desperate or delusional attempt to arrest inevitable American decline? Or do you think that they could potentially resurrect US imperial power and legitimacy into the next century, i.e. this century, I guess?
Right. So, you know, first of all, I mean, let me share with Michael Cox, reiterate that one of the things about capitalism is its ability to adapt and to innovate. It's a really important point. And so methodologically, I approach it this way. There is flat chronological time. And so we can see crisis, you know, surface and then they subside. That's one way of thinking of it. If you take a more complicated temporal method like the French Annales, I'm thinking especially of the work of Fernand Braudel and Leonardo and so on, where if you look at the rise of global capitalism, it's a very long-term, longue durée kind of development. And within that, there are, you know, shorter movements, you know, Kondratiev cycles and what have you. And then there are shorter movements, what Brodel called the time of the journalists, such as perhaps the storming of January 6th. If that is a short-term, time of the journalists, or to come back, or it reflects more powerful social forces, that's a question still to be answered. So I think there are multiple things happening at the same time, but they're happening at different temporal speeds. And one of the things is that the rise of the West and the so-called liberal international economic order, which I have said before, I have grave reservations about calling it such, is that there's also been a long-term rise in states that have not necessarily been within the ambit of the LIO. China certainly was not within the LIO. I mean, what do we do with that? Short-term thinking, right? You got to realize this. American strategic thinkers, in my view, see crises anytime there's a substantive set of questions that are being asked of the international system and of American leadership. That's one thing to note. The other thing is that the internal dynamics within the US is almost always taken for granted. It's a solipsistic, well-oiled machine internally with democratic governance and innovation and so on and so forth. But the old bogeyman, of race has always been here. And what is happening now is that it is just surfaced in a way that made it actually quite dramatic. When I came to the US in 1997, in the first week of teaching my classes, I raised the problem of serious fascist tendencies within the United States, and I had to apologize to students having just come to the US and making such a claim. But it was there for you to see it. If you listen to the type of discourse that say on talk radio, right? It would be hard for anyone to be surprised at what's been happening in the US. So let me put it this way, and Leonardo's point about Gramsci. A social order, right? The first object of hegemonic practice is the local population. It's not the overseas, I mean, right? Where more coercion could be actually applied. And the US population has never been fully interpolated into this discourse of a liberal international economic order. There are people in large chunks of the American population that is deeply skeptical about the United Nations, as both Michael and Leonardo said. There are armed militias in the United States because they believe that the UN is a conduit for third world people to come in and take over America. It might sound absurd, but it is there, right? And then you've got a very large section of the population, especially the African-American population, large sections of the Latino population, that have been historically left on the outside of what American liberalism has had to promise. What I'm trying to say is that the consensus that America supposedly has inside, right, has always been not the case. And so its ability to lead has always been more based upon the suppression of the contradictions within the society. I'll make one last point before I answer the question that was posed, and very quickly. My data comes from the Federal Reserve, and it is pre-COVID data. Half of Americans would not be able to find $400 if they had an unexpected experience. I want anybody to tell me how liberalism is succeeding. The inequality here in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, in China even, one of the things that globalization is supposed to have done is to weed out inefficiencies. What it has done, right? It's produced massive inequalities, and no matter how strong international institutions you have, you're not going to be able to contain that. People have always made history from below and forced the upper classes and the elites to come to terms with the power that they have in numbers. As for IR theory, one of the things about it now is that for a long period of time, it was not really challenged. I mean, realism and liberalism and Marxism, it didn't even used to be constructivism, they've set the basic sort of parameters in which you can think about the world. That's what liberalism is. It gives you a way to think about the world. And that is no longer the case. You know, critical feminism, critical race theory, post-colonialism, post-structuralism, relational constructivism, feminist theory, they've all been asking questions. As they say in cricket, you have to keep the batsman, right? You have to keep asking questions of him, right? And I think that is what's been happening for quite some time now, for at least the past 20 years. Theorists from outside, from the margins, have been asking questions about the fecundity of liberalism and realism and their neos. So the time is propitious for those who want to ask even further questions to keep on doing it. And you know, theory is a dimension of social forces within a society and can't be divorced from it. So I've got bad news for realism and liberalism in terms of theoretical sort of frameworks. They're going to be challenged, not from the pulpit of theory, but this social forces that underwrite the cohesion of post-colonialism and feminist theory and so on.
Thank you so much, Randy. That was really interesting, and I wish we had a bit more time to let you expand on that as well. But we've got a couple of people who've asked questions about Brazil, and they're asking Leonardo, where do you see Brazil fitting into this kind of overall picture? One is that obviously the government of Brazil is very pro-American, despite Brazilian interest may not be actually served by that particular kind of relationship. But where is Brazil going within this broader crisis of the liberal order? And where do you see it kind of going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I was just taking some notes, reading the questions on the Q&A, and thinking about what you're talking about also concerning the possibility of rebuild of the international liberal order. But I'll start with that. So I agree with many points that are Mick and Randy affirmed, because not only because of the US interests on the order, but also concerning China's interests on the order. So it is an important point that we must take into account, because, of course, as Mick puts, we do not have a radical alternative in this moment. So this calls my attention to the comment that Chakrabarti puts on the forum concerning the order that kind of incubate futures. So maybe I'm not making some, I'm just thinking about the role of the state and rethinking the role for good and for bad, and the relationship between state. Going back to Susan Strain's states and markets arguments in this sense, I'm just thinking about how crisis of 2007, 2008, and after that, now the pandemic situation calls attention to the necessity to rethink, or for neoliberals, by one side, as we are seeing now in Brazil, a lot of neoliberal measures, for example, for us, what does it mean to the independence of the central bank that are being discussed right now and approving at the Congress and things like that, or an authoritarian neoliberalism that we're thinking about here in other places, but also the legitimization of some kind of role to the state on economy to take care of people. Because at the same time here in Brazil, we have some streets or some avenues with strikes and manifestations concerning the necessity of the emergency help from the state that stopped last month, and now they're demanding to continue that. And so we have this situation, a guy that was elected like Bolsonaro with a neoliberal agenda, but at the same time in a COVID situation, the necessity that state to be present in the life of individuals. So I think that this is the process that the elements that I was thinking in a Gramscian way concerning the structure and the superstructure and the national level in the sense how politics is important as in the process to think about the possibility of passive revolutions process. Once, as Randy and Mick were talking about, capitalism is very, very plastic. So it can take a lot of morbid, interesting forms. And concerning Brazil, the questions that Berta and Mazzino put on the forum, to be brief, Brazil goes from a position, from a kind of norm shaper concerning BRICS engagement at the beginning and G20 and things like that, to be a norm taker, not now, but with Dilma's government in the last years of Workers' Party as a norm taker, and now worse than that, in a bandwagon compromise with US and very critique of China because some ideological points of this government. So with huge consequences concerning, for example, vax in Brazil. We're having a lot of problems to get products to make vacuum here in Brazil from China or to buy vaccines and etc. etc. But in the sense, I do not see. I can't see a role, an important or a medium role to Brazil in the international order rebuilt in the middle term. I think so, because we do not have economic strength, we do not have ideology. That's the main problem. We're spending our ideological capital, if we can talk about that we used to have, not only from the left party, Workers' Party, but before that we have with, in other moments, our diplomacy and things like that. It connects to the last question from Mazzino. In Latin America, our situation in the region, we're isolated in the region because we have no capacity to influence our neighbors. We have no capacity to mediate conflicts, for example, Venezuela, and do not have capacity to aggregate interests, actions. And for example, we abandoned the CELAC forum. It's the main forum for China to negotiate with Latin American countries. We abandoned this last year, suspended our participation. So we do not have any place to negotiate in a multilateral forum. We put our attention to Trump, and now we are isolated. So we do not have capacity to make that. So even in the region, we're isolated. I think that 10 years maybe could be a period so to re-engage in the region, re-engage with our neighbors and with our partners here, and maybe with the other ones from the so-called BRICS and things like that. And to shape the international order or make some influence, but you can talk more about this if you want.
Thank you. As someone who takes seriously Gramsci's maxim of pessimism of the intellect, which we've had plenty of this afternoon, what about optimism of the will? Can you, in 1 minute each, please, finish with something optimistic in the international or national environment, which you think offers a bright light of some form, some hope?
I've been around longer than all of you, I think, and I'm still extremely optimistic. For both philosophical, humanistic, and I think empirical reasons. I can use the word mankind just for the moment in the non-gendered sense. mankind will, it faces and it will face and it continues to face the most appalling situations and has done throughout history. And sometimes those tragedies are just appalling. However, it sets itself tasks, and they can be resolved. I do have, you know, an optimism in the belief of the human capacity to change the world, reform the world, think about the world. And I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't think that. And I've always believed that ever since I was a young leftist in the 1960s. I mean, the vaccine, in a sense, is an illustration of some kind of degree of optimism. I mean, I'm not putting all my faith in science. The other thing I'd say very quickly, that I think the logic of globalization, and I don't want to go back over the whole debate, which we could have and should have, but I think there is a logic of globalization, which actually, in the end, does actually force cooperation. I'm not being naive. I'm a realist enough, Randolph. I'm realist enough, like John Mearsheimer, to say, you know, the world is becoming very much more competitive. And there's all sorts of dangers out there. But on the other hand, I just can't see any other alternative. And I think it's the logic of globalization itself, if I might say so. This may be an argument for it, Inderjeet. I don't know, a certain kind of globalization, that it necessitates cooperation, because you're never going to solve any of these issues, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate change, or, you know, all the other things we know about, without international cooperation. Finally, I have a great degree of faith in young people. You know, I mean, it's a new generation of very young people. They're energetic, they're full of fight. And, you know, it's not up to me now to do it, but I do have great faith in them. Yeah, enormous amount.
Great, thank you, Mick. Randy?
So I think the stock market is more optimistic than I am. It's an important thing, actually. You want to know, why is it this country and worldwide, there's devastation, economic devastation, Americans lining up for food, and the stock market has no idea. If you want to understand the disconnect of what is happening structurally, that's a good indicator of it. At the same time, I was born in a British colony, and then we became independent, and I can assure you it was not because of the benevolence of London. It is because of the determined work, the conviction that change must come about. And a lot of people lost their lives and they were thrown in prison, this, that, and the other, everywhere, all around the world. So you see, here's the thing. When we talk about the liberal international economic order, invariably we start with the United States. It always has this privileged position of departure. Trump comes in, we reorient all of our ways of looking at the world around the United States. It shouldn't be. There's 1 million people in India right now who have one of the largest you know, movement in the history of the post-war history. There are a lot of things that are happening in many, many other parts of the world. Part of what we have to do is to decenter, right, the United States from the privileged position that it has in always making sense of the world, including the liberal, especially the liberal economic order. We got to look at other places. And not every time, you know, we have a back and forth, you know, short-term shifts and movement within the US. Everybody's called to order to say, what do you have to say? How are you going to theorize that? There are other things happening in other parts of the world. I think Amitav Acharya's has made a really invaluable contribution by introducing the idea of a global IR, of a multiplex world that's not necessarily tied to multipolarity. And it might sound trite, but you know, we have to democratize the knowledge in which we understand the international system. If not, we'll always be back at the same place. What is the US doing? Are they providing the right leadership? Are other people following along accordingly? Those are not necessarily the most useful questions. We need to democratize even the types of questions that we ask and from where we ask them.
Thank you, Randy. That was a little broadcast on behalf of the global webinar series in which you have just participated, actually. So thank you for that. Leonardo, you got the last word. A bit of optimism, please.
Just talking about, I'm trying to, because in the interregnum, the interregnum is morbid, right? And so it's very difficult. But I think concerning Brazil particularly, despite the fact that we do not have a clear alternative center left, but at least, but the hegemony of the alt-right is not so strong as we thought it would be, in my opinion. And I think that in the world also, despite the fact that we have, we saw what happened concerning Trump in US recently and etc. But we're seeing a movement of forces. I think that this is the optimism that I would like to talk about. The point that they're not so passive movements, as Mick talked about the young people, the youth, and talk about another points concerning US stock market. But I think that the political struggle it still goes on, and maybe this is the point that I'd like to reaffirm.
Yeah, great, fantastic. Young people, as Mick said, the farmers in India who are protesting against the conditions that is forced on them, and the fact that the right isn't going to be in great strength and great power for a very much longer time. So I think that's really good, and I think I love this discussion between us. Wish we had a bit more time. We've extended it by 15 minutes as it is to accommodate the very interesting ideas, and sometimes the very best comes out in the Q&A and in the discussions between the panelists themselves. I'm really pleased that the three of you accepted to help launch this series. And although you come from different places and you come from different theoretical and methodological perspectives, I think there's a kind of fair degree of overlap also in your understandings and diagnoses and your hopes for what the world could look like. So thank you so much for making this first panel so interesting and in my view successful. And there's loads of other questions, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to, but you know, it's Friday evening, the beer is getting cold in the fridge, and I think we need to kind of move in that sort of direction. But thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Randy, and thank you, Mick. Thank you so much to Juvaria as well for managing the speaking and the introducing all the speakers, and to Matt and to Tanya for doing all the technicals. And thank you to everyone who came and persisted and stayed for the whole discussion. We've got another discussion next week, and next week we're talking about this little thing called the United Nations. The subtitle is Global Organization, Colonial Roots and Metropolitan Control. So we've got three great speakers. I'll be sending tweets and posters and emails to all and sundry. We look forward to seeing you next week, hopefully. But thanks to the panel today for everything that they've done.
And thank you, Inderjeet, and thank you
so much. Good to see you, Michael and Leonardo, and
you,
Juvaria.
Randolph, and you, Leonardo. Keep well, keep safe.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cheers. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Inderjeet. Well done. Thanks, Juvaria. Lovely. Great. Really enjoyed it.
Bye now.
Bye.
Cheers.
See you.